Welcome to another edition of the Best Business Minds, where we interview business leaders and academics that write thought-provoking books. I'm Marc Kramer, serial entrepreneur who consults with family businesses and entrepreneurs. And currently, I'm teaching entrepreneurship at Vinh University in Hanoi, Vietnam. Today, please welcome Bjorn Billhardt, author of the book, The 12-Week MBA, Learn the Skills You Need to Lead in Business Today. Bjorn, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you for coming, and especially thank you for allowing me to interview on a Sunday morning instead of our normal Friday time. As folks know, I was in the U.S. for 3 weeks, and now I'm back in Hanoi. So I'm glad to have you, and I appreciate you accommodating me. So, Bjorn, before we get into the book, why don't you give us a little bit about your professional background?
Yeah, happy to do it. So I run a company called Ability. We've been doing leadership development programs and mini MBA programs specifically for large Fortune 500 companies for the last decade. I've been in leadership development and education for 25 years. Quickly, I'm from Germany originally, Hamburg. I came to the United States as an exchange student in high school, went to college at the University of Texas, and then went to get my MBA at Harvard Business School in Boston. And while I was at Harvard, I worked with a few of my friends on some field studies to create some interactive online modules. And the school really liked those modules. And so they actually became our first client. And so then we started the business in 2001, grew first a services business that we called Inspire Learning. And then in 2015, after we sold that, we set out to create a new version of the MBA, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we talk through the book as well. But the idea really is that there's a lot of really amazing things that you can learn in a 2-year full-time MBA, but not everyone needs that. And around the world, only a fraction of managers and leaders actually have the luxury of having a full MBA. And so there's a need for those that don't have that luxury to understand some of the basic things about business, value creation, how to lead people. So we have a curriculum called the 12-Week MBA. It's a $2,000 part-time virtual mini MBA curriculum that's been really successful, not just here in the US, but also around the world. We have students from all over the world that are joining us. We have a spring and a fall cohort, and it's 12 weeks long. And the book sort of gives you the synopsis of that curriculum. And so we've been growing. We've had every year we teach over 30,000 students. We've had, a lot of our large corporate clients have hundreds of people internally go through our curriculum. Sometimes they know it's the 12-week MBA. Sometimes they have it as, their corporate learning development program, where we are basically the provider in the background. But every year we teach about 30,000 students, over 100,000 in total already. Just like you, I'm passionate about teaching. I'm passionate about learning, and I'm passionate about business and understanding how the world of business works.
Well, I mean, certainly your program is not only smart, but it's cost effective for these companies. I mean, I taught at Wharton for 10 years, and I'm teaching here at Vinh University, and I'm actually the co-director and co-founder of the new MBA program we're starting. Most of the value when people are spending the really big money, it's the network that you're buying into, not so much what you're going to learn. But when you're trying to teach the masses in your company, certainly what you're offering has got to be the most cost-effective way for a company to take their leaders to the next step. So let's dive right into the book. You mentioned that shareholder value, when properly understood, shows us something about broader stakeholder value as well. Could you elaborate on how measuring shareholder value can provide insights into the value created for other stakeholders like employees, customers, and society, even when the glass is a little bit murky?
Yeah. And by the way, so Mark, I love doing this interactively. You are also obviously a great business mind. So please feel free to chime in and actually, ask follow-up questions. I also encourage, I know this is a small audience here today, and many people are probably listening at home, but also anyone that likes to kind of do a double take or ask a follow-on questions. I really love to make these interactive and have discussions because a lot of these things are not as clear cut and dry. And your first question actually is among one of the most difficult ones that I think is among the most hotly debated ones in business today. Um, what does a business exist to do? And there are really two big strains of thought, right? One is the only thing that business needs to care about is creating value for its shareholders, the people that own the business, right? And shareholders is in a public company, lots of people, but in a private company, it's just the owner, right? It's
Right.
the only purpose of business is to create money for those people that own it. Period, full stop. There's nothing else the business needs to worry about. Everything else is kind of is done by other people, right? Governments, nonprofits, individuals, but businesses don't need to concern themselves, with the environmental impact, with whether they're doing any good in the world. And then there's the other train of thought that says, no, like there's not just shareholders in a business, but there are other stakeholders, and they include many people, employees, customers, of course, who you don't want to, kind of have. Uh, create bad products for, and even people that don't interact with the business at all, like the environment. And we take a stand that's somewhere in the middle. We try to square the round peg here with our book. Um, if you think that a business is not about making money for its owners, I think you're naive and won't last long in the business world, because if a business doesn't make money for its owners, it will ultimately cease to exist and other businesses will take over. So you have to put shareholders, the people that own a business, first. But if you don't also look at your stakeholders, employees, society at large, customers, you will ultimately not create the maximum amount of value for your shareholders. So it's a glass darkly. It's a murky picture. There's no direct correlation. You can't say, hey, by creating environmentally friendly policies and contributing to a cleaner air, that we will directly affect shareholder value. You can't make that connection, right? It's almost impossible to have a formula for that. But in a murky way, in an ambiguous way, if you don't do that, and you have ultimately enough constituents that pressure a government to create regulations that box you in even further, you actually have destroyed value for your shareholders by not taking into account the stakeholders, all of the stakeholders. So that's where there's a little murkiness, but we try to actually show in the book how shareholder value is directly impacted by you thinking about stakeholder value.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I just was thinking about this as you were mentioning, but even on a global basis, if you take a look at the current president of the United States, he's basically looking at Americans as shareholders, not stakeholders. And he's looking at the rest of the world as stakeholders. And so he's decided that I only care about the shareholders, not the stakeholders. I mean, literally, it just occurred to me
Yep, that's a
now.
nice. Yep.
Yeah, and I think without the stakeholders, that you're losing those alliances that could get you more business or entrench you more. So you really have to think about the value of everybody who's connected to your enterprise, right? At the end of the day,
Yeah. Yeah.
but your first priority is the shareholders, just
Yeah.
like the plane's going down, where they tell you the first thing you have to do is put your face mask on before you try anything
Yeah.
else.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really great analogy, actually. And it is actually also like on vice versa true. I think one of the reasons that enabled sort of the current administration was actually that I think sometimes other politicians did not think about shareholder value, right? The actual American people, um, as their main constituency, and sort of went a little bit too broad. So I think it's a fine balance because as a business owner, whether you're head of a government or whether you're a business owner, you do have to be crystal clear about who your shareholders are and that your ultimate goal is to serve them, right? If you're a CEO of a company, you have to tie everything to how your actions create value for your shareholders, for the people that have invested in the business and are owning the business. But if you ignore the stakeholders, I think it's a fantastic analogy. You're ultimately, while you can't draw a direct line, you can ultimately destroy a lot of value for the shareholders. So I like that analogy a lot.
Yeah, thank you. So our next question is the chapter one emphasizes the importance of trust and promise keeping and maintaining shareholder value. And this is very funny because as we're talking about this, when President Trump got elected, he did not lie to the people about what he was going to do. And now he literally is taking his checklist and hitting every one of these things, whether people like it or not. He's going through his list. In today's rapidly changing business environment, how can managers effectively balance the need to make bold, innovative promises with the responsibility of ensuring that they can realistically deliver on those promises and maintain investor confidence?
Yeah. So it's another central theme of the book, because the question after you understand who you're creating value for, the next question is what actually is value? How do you measure value? And the first answer that people always give is, well, you measure value by looking at the stock market. And that's very clear, right? Like there's a value of a business. It's traded on the stock. If people value the business, they buy the stock. If they don't value the business at that price, they sell it. That's the easy answer. That's not actually. I mean, underneath that are thousands and thousands of Wall Street analysts every day that evaluate whether the stock price is a fair one, right? And how you do that and how you actually come up with what a business is valued. That's the hard part. And the hard part of it is that and this is kind of eye-opening for people that haven't really thought about kind of the idea of value, kind of in depth, right? This is what the MBA gives you, right? Is this understanding of what is value. The hard part of this is that all of the value of a business, of a business that has a future, is tied up in the future. So yes, the past matters, because it allows you to understand what the future may hold. But all of the value of a business, and we'll talk about kind of like how you actually, uh, kind of mathematically come up with value, because it's really important to understand that the math behind it, but all of the value of a business lies in the future revenue streams and cash flow streams that the business generates. Now, the future, by its definition, is uncertain, and it includes risk. And we talk about one of the most critical things that's often overlooked, when when people think about value creation, is not just the element of risk, but also the element that trust and promise keeping plays the role that trust and promise keeping plays in this element of risk, right? You can create a lot of short-term value as a new CEO of a company, let's say, by basically looking at the business and saying to the world, right, in annual shareholder meetings, um, this business is going to double in size in the next 5 years. I mean, you could do that. And, initially everyone will say, hey, it's a new CEO. They seem to know what they're doing. I'll believe them. All of a sudden, your stock rises, right? Like just you saying, hey, we're going to double in the next 5 years. That's what it doesn't, you can just say that, right? Because the future is uncertain. You can say anything you want about the future. The problem is if you then don't deliver on those promises,
You
you
get
erode
hammered.
trust. Yeah, you erode trust, and the promise that you made, becomes an empty promise, and all of a sudden your stock price will tank, right? If that's why these forecasts are so important, right? So, um, in my mind, there's a lot of business schools that talk about the mechanics of what how to calculate the value of a business, right? And we do that as well. And you have to sort of go through the mathematical formula, right? Like value is the kind of present value of all the future cash flows that a business generates, right? Like there's a formula for it. And, in my Harvard MBA, I went through, thousands of these calculations for here is now the value of the business. What I have not heard a lot of professors talk about, and I think one of the most critical elements is that all those future cash flow projections are based on you trusting that they're based on at least reasonable assumptions. And one of the most important things a business manager can do is to make sure that trust in your projections gets upheld. Because if you promise something and it doesn't deliver, that's when you destroy actual shareholder value. And that goes for the CEO on the large scale, right? Like promising the future cash flow streams of a full business, all the way down to the manager that promises that a certain new product gets released on day one or on day, in 30 days. And then if that trust is broken and the product gets released in 60 days, well, all of a sudden you've now destroyed shareholder value. So we talk a lot about the the value of trust or the importance of trust in actually valuing the business.
Well, I mean, right, Elon Musk showed the future value of Tesla, and he started hitting his numbers, and people trusted what he was telling them, and now he's the richest guy in the world. And astoundingly, he in 12 years has basically pushed aside Boeing as the main rocket company for the United States, right? In 12 years, he's upended almost 100-year-old company, Boeing. It's astounding in such a short period of time, because I guess a lot of it's based on what you've just said and him getting the trust of investors that they actually believe what these numbers are going to be
Yeah.
and follow through.
Yeah.
It,
But
it,
I love this interactive dialogue so much more interesting than just kind of, but like the interesting thing here I find is that when you look at, much of Elon Musk's wealth is based on the value that the market values Tesla at. Much of
right.
the value of
Thanks.
Tesla, yeah, much of the value of Tesla is based on people believing that Tesla is not just an automotive company, but is an AI-enabled robotics company, right? Like when you look at the total market of cars in the world and how much cash would be generated if, let's say, Tesla becomes, the dominant player in the market, which is very doubtful when you look at, all the Chinese competitors coming in now, you still wouldn't get to the value that Tesla is today. So you have to believe that Tesla is more than just a car company, that these new robots and this AI is ultimately going to create a lot more value than simply driving cars. Um, and that's based on the promise that Elon Musk makes, right? So will it come to fruition? Who knows, right? Even, of course, he doesn't know. But it is very important for every CEO and for every manager, really, to think very hard about the promises that they make. Because the value of a company is literally based on your promises and on how much people believe in your promises. Right now, a lot of people believe in Elon Musk's promise. And, who knows? But at this point, it's very interesting. That's the only reason why he is the richest man in the world, is because there's trust in that vision of Tesla being a lot more than just a car company.
No question about it. And that's what great CEOs bring to the table. Great entrepreneurs is that people over time believe in them. In chapter 2, in the context of the Nokia example, and you can talk a little bit about that, the chapter mentions investors shrugging off the release of the iPhone, considering that the risk is presented as one of the three drivers of value. How can managers better assess and communicate potential disruptive threats to shareholder value, even when those threats seem insignificant at first glance? So maybe you can tell the story about that and explain that to the audience.
Yeah, so the interesting thing is, right, you can obviously trust someone's projection, but what no one knows, the person that the CEO that tells the story and the people that hear the story is what happens, right? What will happen in the real world. A lot of people trusted Nokia's story that they would continue to be the number one cell phone maker in the world. There was no reason to believe that Nokia wouldn't be the number one cell phone maker in 10 years, 20 years. And so a lot of Nokia's value, the way where Nokia was traded on the stock market, was just simply based on that assumption, on that promise. And then what we talk about in the book is, a little event happened. It was Apple's Steve Jobs introducing the iPhone. And you can see from the stock market of Nokia, Apple hadn't actually sold any iPhones at that time. But you immediately could say, you could see how the value of Nokia, dramatically got reduced just by that announcement by Apple, because all of a sudden the story of Nokia dominating the cell phone market was no longer as believable as before. And actually, I mean, the most recent example, right? When you looked at Nokia, when you looked at all of the stocks of Nvidia and all the other chip makers, when China released DeepSeek, you saw the market value of almost all US tech companies crater by 20-30%.
It's
Just
incredible.
on, yeah, just on all of a sudden the promise that all this AI needed a ton of data centers, a ton of chips, a ton of new computers. All of a sudden, the Chinese seemed to have said, no, we don't need that much computing power to create good AI models. And everyone's value tanked by 30%. So you very much can see how value is tied to future promises and the believability of them.
That's what makes business so interesting every single
Hmm.
day, is why things turn out the way they do, right? I
Hmm.
mean, even like if you think about it, if Elon Musk decided that he said, I've created the newest phone using AI that's so far superior to what Apple has, and Apple hasn't created anything new since Steve Jobs died, then people would be. And he said, I'm raising this much money. I'm going to put public offering. That thing would go through the roof, right? I mean, all of a sudden, Apple stock would take a tank, and whatever he was doing, people would bet on it because, like you said, they're betting on the future.
Hmm.
Uh,
Yeah.
and they would be super excited about what he was doing. The chapter on profitability highlights the importance of managing trade-offs between cost reduction and customer value. Could you elaborate on how companies can develop a framework for making these decisions, especially when the impact on shareholder value is not immediately apparent?
Yeah, so that's another one of the central themes of the book is, everything in business is about trade-offs, right? If you wouldn't actually need to have an MBA or really honestly any judgment for that matter if business was simply just a mathematical formula, right? Like you can just hire a bunch of math geniuses and they would run businesses without judgment. That's obviously not what's happening in the real world. And there are some very central trade-offs that managers have to make all the time. And one of the most central ones is between growth and profitability. When you think about it, a business can be very profitable if it doesn't focus on growth. You just cut out all new sales, you cut out all new research and development, and all of a sudden the business today becomes very profitable. Now, what it trades off with is future growth. If you don't have any if you don't have any salespeople, if you don't have any R&D, you won't have any revenue 2 years from now. So clearly, that's not the best idea for a business. On the flip side, a business can invest all of its resources in sales and R&D and make zero profits. Now, that's also not good because if you continue to make zero profits year after year, you're also not creating shareholder value. With a few exceptions, if you're Amazon, you can do that for 20 years and ultimately become one of the richest companies in the world. But most of the time, you need profits at some point. Not just 20 years later to be able to create actual value for the shareholders who want money back that they invested in. So the central trade-off that we talk about in the book is between growth and investing in growth, managing for profitability today. And then the third element of that trade-off is risk, right? Because if you invest in growth and the growth doesn't materialize, you have risked part of the business. And so growth, profitability, risk, we have a framework around that. Probably in the short amount of time that we have here, it's probably a little bit too hard to go into the details of it, but if you read the book, I think you'll hear this recurring theme. And actually, this is also the recurring theme in our 12-week mini MBA curriculum. And we actually, so the entire 12-week mini MBA is actually you play games. So there's no lecture in our 12 weeks. It's all business games that we play, and we put people in business competitions. And it's
Simulations?
Yes, yes. So the entire, so we're a bit, I should have mentioned this at the beginning, we're actually a simulation-based company. So we do simulation-based leadership development, simulation-based business. And but the central theme that we build these simulations around is these trade-offs between managing a company for growth, right? Managing a company for current profitability, and then assessing the risk of investments that you make for future growth. And as you go through our simulations in the 12-week MBA, you get to kind of experience the gut-wrenching trade-offs that you have to make as a business leader between those three very important components of business.
I have to say, I just became more aware of simulation games in the past year. And I can see why the younger generation, I'm 64, who've been playing video games, especially business video games, are good are very smart strategic thinkers. What the stuff that you do makes them be better strategic thinkers and thinking steps ahead as opposed to being reactionary. I mean, if anybody who hasn't used these simulation tools like what you're offering, they're missing out on a lot. And we're trying to integrate them more into our business school as part of the activity of every class. How has AI changed what you're teaching students now?
Well, so that's one of my favorite topics is AI. I think will have a huge impact on the educational landscape. So our simulations before AI were basically you sit in a room with others, and we do virtual and in the classroom, and we work actually a lot with universities. So we're embedded in programs at UCLA and at University of Texas and IMD. Um, Typically, in the simulation, what you do is you put people into roles and then they have to make decisions in their role, and you get information and then you collaborate with others. That was really fun and exciting, and you're competing with other teams. So we've done this for 15 years and it's super fun, super engaging. Before AI, now AI comes along, and all of a sudden, instead of you having a choice of, A, B, C, do you set the price here? Do you set the price there? We have an analyst come up that, you have to talk to. And now this is an AI character. And right now it's just chat, but we're actually experimenting with voice, and eventually it's going to be video, where you have to interact with employees, solve difficult problems for them. But instead of making decisions, A, B, C, you actually have to do the same that you have to do in the real world. You have to talk with them. So we have these elaborate characters that we've now embedded in our simulations that are really gnarly problems that you are faced with. And the AI is just a fantastic tool, because also at the end, we give everyone insight in what everyone else has done, right? So you get to see, hey, I may have been really harsh on this employee, or I may have fired this employee, but three other people in my class, they coached them through it, and all of a sudden they have a star employee now. Whereas I have no one because I just fired them. So
Go ahead.
no, so it's a fascinating world in which education, I think, is going to look very different, because it's no longer just lecture. It's really, let's learn by doing, and AI is going to I think provide rocket fuel for that type of learning.
No question. How have leaders have to adapt differently? Like, what are you teaching now for leaders and how they should manage businesses from startup to, getting investors to get excited about what they're doing to an existing business and uh, getting people from around the world, because there's very few businesses, even the smallest business has virtual assistants in other parts of the world or has consultants and so forth. So how is what you started with when you were first teaching people in your mini MBA, how's that all changed now in what you're teaching?
In the face of AI. I mean, it's I actually think the fundamental principles of what we teach in business haven't changed in a century, right? Like, and I don't think AI will change that. Like the fundamental trade-offs that we just talked about, right? Like the trade-offs between growth, profitability, and risk, the understanding that value is future. I mean, those are pretty constant. AI is not it's not going to change the laws of nature, right? Like gravity will still exist. What value in a business will still exist. Um, I do think AI will change some of the equations, right? When you think about, businesses really will have to adapt pretty quickly to a world in which it is super easy to create new things. And for a competitor to simply replicate, entire software suites. We have our software developers. I mean, it's really incredible how fast they have adopted AI. And I, just saw recently one of our CTO actually, it's like, hey, here's this new thing that we developed. It's like, well, what if we move the button over here and do this? And he just, speaks it in, and all of a sudden the AI creates the code for that. That's a game changer for software development. So we're all going to have to, and I think a huge case for the business education that you do and the business education that we do, because if you don't understand the implications of value creation, of growth, profitability, and risk, of what this type of AI will enable, then you're going to be left in the dark, and other competitors will speed up their development to the point where it's yeah, it'll destroy your business. So I think actually the in my mind, the fundamentals of business education are not changing. I think AI is going to dramatically increase the importance of people understanding how business operates. And I think that bodes really well for any type of educational institution that can effectively teach basic business acumen skills to people, because they will become, in a world where innovation moves even faster than it did in the last 10 years, it's going to become even more important to sift through the clutter and actually get the bigger picture view of how a business op or what is important in a business, because if that will allow you as a manager and ultimately as a leader of a business to make the best decisions.
How are you training leaders now? Because leadership, I'm 64. Leadership has changed so much since the 80s, where the leader was king and everybody basically worked within drive time of them. And now your
It's
employees, no matter what size company, are dispersed around the world, and they have options around the world
Yeah,
now.
that's a great
So
question.
how are you training the future leaders?
Yeah. So what's fascinating is we have multiple simulations, right? From business acumen to decision making to people management. What we often hear, the most valuable simulation that we have, that people, when they kind of come back, a year later and say, this was what really helped me in my career. The most valuable simulation we have is on influencing skills.
Yep.
And the interesting thing is when you think about when business schools got created 100 years ago, I don't think that was a curriculum on influencing skills. Like it wasn't even thought of as an important business skill, because there's a business and there has a CEO and then there are department managers, and they do what you say, right? That's how business used to operate 100 years ago. And, in many ways, I mean, there's important to that hierarchy. So why would you need to have influencing skills to be successful in business? Well, it turns out in this rapidly changing world that this hierarchical structure can lead to slowness and inefficiencies that will make you not competitive as a business. So I think a lot of what the transformation of business schools that have occurred in the last 20 years is there's been when business schools started, it was all about just the numbers. Understanding how numbers work, right? Accounting, those types of things. I think in the last 20 years, it has been a quite dramatic shift with business schools and business leaders realizing that at least half of business success is not tied to you understanding the numbers. It's tied to you being able to create the people infrastructure that creates innovation that moves the business forward. And that means, some of the best ideas sometimes come from the newest intern that just joined the company. How you elevate that idea then, and how you make sure that it gets the light of day, while other ideas that, by more senior leaders may not see the light of day. Those skills are far more important than, kind of the mathematical skills of calculating profit and loss. And I think I would imagine that with AI, that that type of that part of business education is becoming even more important. So we are investing in a lot of um, products now that are around this idea of influencing skills, of people management skills, of mentoring skills, of understanding the human side of the equation. In fact, in the 12-week MBA, half the book and half the curriculum is on that people side of the equation, not on the numbers.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so going at chapter three, what are the key trade-offs a business should consider when deciding between organic growth, increasing sales within existing markets, and inorganic growth, acquiring competitors or entering the new markets? What's your take on that?
Yeah, and we're now getting into the weeds of the book, and I know we're all over halfway through this already. So I'll try to be concise on some of these detailed questions because I mean that is a whole, it's both a full chapter in the book, but then obviously in the curriculum, it's a whole component of it is understanding some of these trade-offs. So
We want them to read the book, so we want you
exactly,
to
yeah.
give them the cliff
I'll
notes.
I'll give a hint at what is in the book exactly. Um, so one of the things that business leaders often have to decide, right, is do I invest in existing capabilities or do I buy outside capabilities, right? And so without going into all of the nuance of what a business leader think about it, I think it comes back to the same idea that we talked about at the beginning, which is if you really understand how to create value, then you think about this differently, right? So um, uh, a lot of times people, business leaders make mistakes in terms of buying companies, thinking that, well, if I buy this company, I grow the top line, I grow my bottom line, so I create value. Well, not necessarily, because if the money that you pay to buy the business is more than the future cash flow streams that you can generate by buying the business, you may look better because you're bigger, but you haven't actually created value. In fact, many times, and I think the McKinsey studies are like over 50% of the time, a business acquisition actually destroys value.
No
Um,
question.
and it's because leaders believe in themselves too much, and they believe in their own stories too much. But when you actually look at, the price that a leader paid for an acquisition versus the additional future revenue streams that came from that acquisition, over 50% of the time you've destroyed value by buying businesses.
I mean, you take a look at when Facebook bought WhatsApp, and they paid 19 billion dollars, 4 billion in cash, 15 billion in shares of stock for a company that was only making 50 million, and only had 500 million users, I think, at that particular point. And I don't think there was ever a time that they could catch up to the amount of money that they spent, even owning all those patents, because there've been ways around those patents. So it's a good example about how
Yeah.
and the founders of WhatsApp didn't even stay. Once they
Yep.
got grinded up in the machine, right? Then large companies tend to destroy the value just because the people got caught up in the bureaucracy.
Yeah. Although I will say on that example, which I find a fascinating example, right? Because it was such a huge discrepancy between the price paid and the money, the actual physical money that they got,
Right.
right? So
Yeah.
you're right. Like from a pure cash flow perspective, like will they ever have gotten that money back? Absolutely not. But
Yeah.
I will say the argument on the other side of that, this is why business is so fascinating, right? Because there's never a right or wrong answer. You'll never know. But on the other side, what they did do, and this is, I guess, the argument for buying a tiny company at a ridiculous valuation, right? Is that they
Yep.
did take a competitor off the market, right? So it's hard to say what would have happened, right? But if they had not bought it, could it have ultimately destroyed all of Facebook by becoming the next thing that people do? And if everyone had moved away from Facebook over, and if WhatsApp had created all the, there was the chance that everyone would have started to use WhatsApp
WhatsApp for that.
and and all of a sudden, because everyone was already on there. And so sometimes, and this is like crazy, sometimes people pay extraordinary sums for almost no cash flow, no future cash flow promises. Um, but there's still a strategic reason, which is like, if it means taking out something that could destroy the entire revenue stream of a business, it actually may make sense to do that. So I think I mean, this is fascinating business, right? Like it makes no sense from it from the perspective of looking at just the numbers. But when you think about it strategically, there may have been, a good reason. You will never know because they clearly bought it and now it's part of Facebook.
And you're right. I mean, business have been doing that for 100 years. GM used to buy out new auto technology just to suppress it.
Yep.
I mean, they could have electric cars, 30 years before Elon Musk even bought into the guys who founded Tesla, right?
Yep.
But they were killing these things off early on. So that's
Yeah.
been going on for a long time. In chapter 4, in the profitability chapter, the text mentions that the managing profit is a balancing act between two levers, an act performed with customers, competitors, employees, and suppliers, all shaking your tightrope. Could you elaborate on the strategies for maintaining this balance, particularly when the interests of these stakeholders conflict?
Yeah. So this goes back to this profitability versus growth, right? So some of your stakeholders, right, are clearly more interested in one versus the other, right? Employees, they're more interested in growth than profitability when you think about it, right? Like growth will give more opportunities. So you'll have a lot of people arguing for growth that are within the company, and rightfully so. More profitability oftentimes means less people, means less resources, right? It means saving money versus growing. Um, you customers is another great example, right? Your customers are stakeholders. They're not shareholders, but they're stakeholders. They care about good customer service, right? Like they want a fully staffed support department, right? So they can call them anytime. Now, that stands in conflict sometimes to profitability, right? So, um, so it's this tight, and we love the word. My co-author Nathan came up with this great thing. It's being a manager is being on a tightrope with everyone shaking the rope. When you think about that's your job as a manager, you actually get a lot more comfortable with the stress and the uncomfortness that you feel when you're on the tightrope. When you just think about like, yeah, this is my job, is to be on a tightrope. Everyone's shaking the tightrope. One wants me to fall off on that side, the other wants me to fall off on that side, and I got to just maintain that balance. We found that a lot of the managers that you have used that analogy just become a lot calmer in their and a lot less stressed in their daily interactions. And that goes, the CEO obviously has one of the most important tightropes, right? They've got to manage for profitability today because investors demand it, but they also have to make sure that they make investments for the future. So that's the one of the bigger tightropes. But every manager at every part of the organization manages a part of that tightrope as well, right? You have a team that, they may want more time to create the most perfect product, but you know that if you don't get the product out the door, in 30 days, your competitors may eat your lunch. So you manage that tightrope between, do we work this weekend to get things out the door? Do we extend the deadline and risk our competitors overtaking us? Or do we just let it be and just, see what happens? So everyone in the company is kind of every leader in a company, every manager has to really think about the various constituencies and how that rope is being shaken and realize that the job of a manager is to very carefully stay on that tightrope.
In the risk chapter, the example of Deutsche Telekom's 2019 annual report highlights the difficulty of anticipating a black swan. I mean, there was no way we saw I mean, I did because I was working in the financial service field, but for the rest of us, 2008, you couldn't anticipate that. The market crashed. And then having the pandemic that we had, nobody could foresee that coming. Given the traditional risk assessment methods may fall short in these situations, what alternative approaches can companies use to build resilience and adapt to unforeseen disruptions?
Yeah, that's a great question, and another part of the book that that oftentimes gets overlooked in traditional business schools is just the importance of understanding risk and understanding the uncertainty that we face in this world when as business leaders, we have to make decisions, right? In business school, it's oftentimes you Monday morning quarterback on what could have happened in the real world, right? You have all the data available. When you're in the hot seat, when you're in the real world, you oftentimes don't have the data to make the right decision. And you oftentimes don't know when a black swan comes in. That's the whole definition of a black swan. You just don't know. You can't even plan for it. So in that chaotic world that we live in and that we have to accept as managers, the higher we go in an organization, the more uncertainty we face. You're not getting more information by as you move in your career. You actually get less information. You have to make more difficult decisions with less information, and with less certainty. And so I'd say the only thing there's a lot of other books that are written about, kind of risk and risk management. It's a whole field of business that we only touch on very lightly because it's a complex field. But the important part, I think, for every manager is to understand that dealing with this uncertainty with the black swans, like a COVID, is basically the definition of the job. It's basically it's not an auxiliary thing. It's a central thing to you managing. You can manage all the project plans you want. You can manage all the plans you want, but your central job is to make sure that you understand there will be black swans. What the next one is, you will not know, and no one will be able to tell you. But your job will be to manage it. And once you accept that as part of the core of your job, you actually can prepare. And we'd have a few tips that I can't get into now, but like there's a few things in the book that will allow you to help feel more comfortable with that next one. We're not going to predict what that will be, but there are tools to allow you to manage yourself and others through events like that.
In chapter 5, you mentioned that a company's debt can be a symptom of financial strength rather than weakness, using AT&T as an example. While you provided factors that make creditors confident in AT&T, are there specific financial ratios or metrics derived from the balance sheet that can quickly indicate whether a company's debt level is a healthy or a cause for concern? In other words, beyond simply observing regular and predictable cash flow, what quantitative measures can be used?
Yeah, another deep dive question that we touch on in the book because we're certainly not going to make leverage buyout experts out of people going through a 12-week mini MBA, but there are just a few things to think about when you think about debt levels, right? The most important thing is that the if you have debt as a company, you have to pay interest on it. It's just a fact of life, right? And um, and the quality of the future cash flows that your company generates uh, is directly related to your ability to pay that interest. If your cash flow is highly uncertain or fluctuates a lot, it's very hard for you to be able to maintain constant interest rate payments. So what we talk about with AT&T actually, people were looked at AT&T and looked at this massive amount of debt that they had and was like, that well, that's really risky. Well, actually, turns out it wasn't as risky because AT&T has some very predictable cash flow streams. Everyone needs a phone, and unless the world goes under, we will all pay our AT&T bill. And so the cash flow streams are pretty stable. They're diversified and they're predictable. So that means a company can take on more debt. And so we talk a little bit in the book about how the debt levels of a company can actually tell you a little bit about um, how uncertain management feels their future cash flow streams are. Now, sometimes companies pretend that their future cash flow streams are predictable and certain when they're actually not, right? And that's when you get into trouble. We have this great example actually in the curriculum, not in the book, about Lucent Technologies, who made everyone believe that they had stable cash flow streams. And turns out that they didn't, and then ultimately it bankrupted the company because one of the biggest things that does bankrupt companies is when you take on too much debt, thinking you have too predictable revenue stream or you have predictable revenue streams when you do not.
Six highlights the importance of viewing the P&L, cash flow statement, and balance sheet in concert to get a comprehensive understanding of a company's financial health. Can you elaborate on some specific examples of how these three statements interact? For instance, how would an increase in accounts receivable on a balance sheet potentially impact the cash flow statement and the P&L? And what conclusions could an investor draw from this interaction?
Yeah, so this actually is the specific Lucent example that again I don't think we actually touch on in the book, but we have in the curriculum, which is just this fascinating example where um, uh, Lucent Technology in the run-up of the last boom, the dot-com boom, had this incredibly rising revenue, right? And so it was a darling on Wall Street. Everyone loved the idea that, in the internet boom, and this actually, by the way, has implications on some of the companies supplying the AI boom right now, and specifically companies like NVIDIA and Microsoft, right? So everyone loves these companies when there's a new technology and, the suppliers of the base components of the technology. Of course, everyone's going to buy. And back in the day from Lucent, it was routers, right? So everyone's going to buy lots of routers. So what happens is Lucent's revenue rose, through into the stratosphere. And there was no indicator that this wasn't going to be a huge success. Now, if you had actually looked not just at the income statement and the revenue, but you actually had understood the balance sheet. And then there's a large portion of the book that's actually the hardest portion of the book is about the balance sheet and the statement of cash flow, because they're not as intuitive as statements. So, and in the curriculum, we spent some time on those statements, because if you actually understand those statements, you can identify risks. And the risk that you could have identified with Lucent that not a lot of investors did and got burned quite a bit was that as Lucent's revenue rose, Lucent's accounts receivable rose even faster. Now, accounts receivable, and for those listeners that are not familiar with it, it's basically money that your customers owe you, but that aren't yet cash, right? So sometimes someone buys, a router from Lucent and says, "I'll pay you later." I'll pay you in 30 days and 60 days. And Lucent says, "Sure, here's the router. Um, go pay me in 60 days," right? That's how business works. Now, you can't actually, if you don't have the cash, you can record the revenue for it, but you don't have the cash. So, what happened with Lucent actually sold these routers to all of these dot-com startup companies. And all these dot-com startup companies said to Lucent, "I need the routers now because I have this huge thing that's blowing up," right? They bought the routers. Lucent recorded the revenue on their income statement, so the revenue was, astronomically rising. Um, what was also rising was what a little account called accounts receivable on the balance sheet, which basically that's where you park all of the dollars that you sold, but that you haven't received cash from. And when you look at the accounts receivables on the balance sheet, that dramatic increase would have been a telltale sign that something could go wrong. And of course, when the dot-com crash happened, everything did go wrong because guess what happened to all the dot-coms that said to Lucent, give me the router, I'll pay you later. Well, they were not going to pay when they're bankrupt, and these dot-coms went under. All the cash got taken away. They didn't pay Lucent, and Lucent stood there with lots and lots of bad debt ultimately, and it actually bankrupted the company. The stock dropped by 99%. And so it just illustrates the importance of not just looking at, your income statement, but also some of these other really important levers that you find only on the balance sheet and on the statement of cash flow.
Yeah, and Lucent just felt like just like the dot-coms back then, just get the sales and don't worry about if you get and when you're going to get the money. Just be able to say
Yeah.
you've booked these sales,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, huge business lesson.
So we're almost out of time here,
I
and
know.
your book
We're only halfway through the book.
I know, and we have so much, and there's so much depth to the book. And very substantive questions. Regarding the example of Netflix's near failure due to its DVD subscription model, how could they have better predicted the cash flow crunch before offering the 3-month free trial, and what specific metrics or analysis would have been most helpful?
So outside of Lucid, Netflix probably is the most interesting example out of the book. I'm in the 3 minutes that we have, I'm not sure I can get to that through that entire case study. But it is a case study. If you're interested in the book or you're on the fence, I would say buy the book just to understand the Netflix case study. Here's the riddle in Netflix. Netflix um, grew too fast and grew faster than expected. And because of that, they almost went bankrupt. So the riddle is, how can a company grow faster than expected and go bankrupt because they grew too fast? It's a fascinating thing, completely counterintuitive. You would imagine if a business grows fast, well, of course, you would get more money and you would actually not you'd face less risk of bankruptcy than more. But it was precisely uh, because of the differences between profitability, growth profitability, and actual cash flow that Lucent got into, not Lucent, that Netflix got into a very precarious position because they were too popular and too many people wanted the Netflix service. I won't be able to give you the solution on why that happened here, but if you read the book, it is probably my favorite example of the entire book.
I think we have time for one more question. On chapter 8
And
mentions that, yeah.
and there's a free ask for a free copy. Send me an email, and we'll see what we can do. So anyone that sends me an email, I will process. I can't promise everyone a free copy, but please do send me an email. Stay in touch. We'll figure out how to make that happen.
So awesome, especially for people up on a Sunday morning listening
Yeah.
in the East. Here's the last question, and the chapter 8 mentions that companies may go back and forth between different cost structures as their needs and market context evolve, such as Amazon shift and reshift of its logistics model. What are some of the key indicators or trigger points that should prompt a company to reevaluate its existing cost structure and consider a shift? And I'm sure taxes also enter into that equation as well.
Yeah, so we have in one of our simulations one of the more interesting trade-offs that managers face all the time, which is do we invest in something now that costs more money today but saves us money in the future, right? And you can, or do we, or do we go forward? And I mean, you face this as a consumer all the time, right? Like, do I buy an annual subscription to my favorite magazine now? It costs me less overall, but it locks me in for the entire year, right? I can't get my money back. So it's the very same question that you face as a consumer all the time. Do I pay monthly, $20 every month, or do I pay $100 for the year? It reduces my overall cost, but I have less flexibility. It's one of the central trade-offs that you make as a consumer all the time and that you make as a manager and as a business leader. And again, without giving away the answer here, because we are out of time, and I think our listeners would appreciate a timely end. Um, but the trade-off um, between that flexibility, but paying more, and locking yourself in, reducing your ability to move, and also obviously paying cash today, but in exchange getting higher margins, paying less. Central theme in business, central theme in the book, and in our simulation. For those of you interested in the curriculum, we have a new cohort starting in March. And we do have, especially for those of you overseas, we have discounts. So email me if you're interested in the curriculum. But I won't give the answer why, but one of the simulations that we run where you compete with others is very much centered on making the right decision around that trade-off. Investment now in exchange for profitability over time, but also less flexibility. That central trade-off, if you manage it correctly, will make you win in the simulation and beat your competitors in this really fun game that we have in the curriculum.
To say the hour went way too fast. I love the book. I think it's very substantive. Obviously, we had some significant questions and couldn't get through the whole book, but I hope folks will get the book and will see the real value here. So I want to thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today.
Yes, thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure. And hope people got some value out of this. And again, please email me if you're interested in either the book or the curriculum. We're seeing some dramatic growth actually around the world here with our curriculum. So it'll be a fun journey for us as we try to manage our profitability and growth.
To everybody, and we'll be back to a normal schedule on Friday. And we look forward to seeing you all then. Have a great day.
Thank you so much.